Hey everyone, and welcome to another edition of DroneLife News. Joining me as always is the editor-in-chief of DroneLife.com. You know her, I know her as Miss Miriam McNabb. Miriam, how are you doing?
I am doing excellent. As always, happy to be here with you. How are you?
Doing great. I greatly appreciate all the smiles as usual, which I think will bring us into our first piece of news. You know, Miriam, I was going to say, I thought a lot of people would really be smiling about the Mavic 3 release. And it seems like, well, that may not be the entire case. But nonetheless, Miriam, this new drone did just come out. And for those who haven't been privy to this news just yet, what is in this new Mavic 3?
So Mavic 3, it had been teased for months, as you know, new Mavic products or new DJI products often are. You know, at DroneLife, we kind of just do it when it's released. We say what the final specs and features are. We put it out there. You know, this is the next release of the very, very popular Mavic. It has a longer flight endurance, 45 minutes. It's got dual sensors. It's got 4K video. You know, DJI certainly sort of touting this as sort of next level for content creators. And again, DJI's marketing, as we've mentioned before, is really shifting to this kind of prosumer content creator space in addition to the commercial and professional applications for their drones. So, you know, that's from the DroneLife perspective, that's what it is. We rely on people like you to tell us sort of how it's working and what you're hearing from the flying community about the DJI Mavic 3 release. What do you think?
Well, Miriam, you bring up some really important points. Drone Deploy this weekend mentioned that the Mavic 3 does not offer an SDK or a software developer kit. What this means is that any third-party application that drone pilots are used to using will not, work on the Mavic 3. That also includes things like Drone Deploy, things like Pix4D Capture, things like Litchi, which really hinders the value of the drone itself. As you know, we had written an article kind of comparing the Mavic 3 price point to the true value, stating that if this drone could do mapping with the dual cameras, it could be fantastic for inspections, industrial work, and commercial work as a whole. But because the drone does not actually have a mechanical shutter, even though the leaks showcase that it did, and it does not have this SDK, it really limits the value of the aircraft as a whole. And if you tack on the fact that the drone is really being flown by the DJI Fly app, they have further kind of dumbed down the user experience and eliminated some extremely important safety features, like being able to see the battery's voltage on main screen. So these things kind of combined have really showcased, well, maybe not as much of an eccentric interest in the drone. We had launched an Instagram poll asking people, well, now that the Mavic 3 has come out, are you going to be buying one? And surprisingly enough, 78% of the almost 1,000 people that had answered the poll said no, that they were not going to buy that drone, which I found honestly pretty interesting. Now, I've got a question for you. As you know, a lot of people are assuming that as soon as a new drone comes out, that it essentially replaces a bunch of other new drones. But is that really the case?
It really isn't. And, you know, Paul, you and I have mentioned this before, but the research doesn't bear that out. In fact, the fleet is very slow to change, really. Of course, there are always new companies utilizing drone technology. There are companies expanding their fleet and buying new tools, but a lot of the one and two drone shops out there doing professional drone work are very slow to change their fleet. I mean, fleet information, even as recently as a couple of years ago, showed the 3DR Solo as sort of the number 5 on the list. You know, people really don't get rid of their drones until they have to, or until there's a very compelling reason to upgrade. I got to ask you, Paul, what do you think? You know, we just mentioned that DJI's marketing, I have noticed in the releases that I get, has shifted towards this kind of content creator audience. And you wonder if maybe they're going back to their roots and saying, hey, we'll focus in on that recreational audience again. Certainly with no SDK, and if you can't use some of the really important tools in the drone ecosystem, like a drone deploy, that's going to limit the value for professionals or people flying for commercial applications like construction, inspection, and so forth.
Yeah, it does beg the question of if their direction is kind of to service the more creative, recreational kind of gamut of the industry. Although I'm not really sure that is the case when you also consider the price point as a whole. Rob and I were just discussing the amortization schedule of this type of drone, meaning how long is it going to take us to essentially pay off this drone under normal working conditions. And with the lack of SDK, because the Mavic 3 doesn't fly, as aggressively as something like an Inspire 2, you're really limited in the proximity of shots that you can get, the complexity of shots that you can get. Without the SDK, you're really limited on the industrial work that you can do, roof inspections and such. And so it would take a significantly more amount of time to be able to cover the cost of this drone and profit off of it. And, with all of that said, even if you're a recreational pilot, you are typically thinking about, okay, how much do I really need to use this to make it worth it? And the calculation is pretty expansive, frankly. And so are they trying to service the creative community? Maybe they just haven't released the SDK yet. Maybe this drone wasn't fully ready to go, but they wanted to launch it ahead of the holiday season because all of the competitors' drones you simply can't buy right now. I mean, we saw this morning that Autel on the B&H website, you can't buy any of their drones until next year. So I think maybe instead of focusing on, say, the recreational community, I think DJI is trying to capitalize on the lack of available products on the market as a whole.
Yeah, maybe. Maybe. I mean, certainly they are still absolutely the dominant providers in the marketplace. So
yeah, 100%.
And for people coming into, I think, for newcomers into the drone industry, if you see kind of the latest model, that's in general your choice. You don't tend to compare the Mavic 3 with the Mavic 2, right? And say, oh, I think I'll go with the Mavic 2 if you're just coming into the industry and you're buying your first drone.
Yeah, that's a very important point, which brings us to our next story, which also involves a Mavic. It's just not a new Mavic, and this might actually be the first case or the first published case that we have seen of extremely nefarious behavior with drones. Miriam, I've got to say, when I read this story on your site, I was kind of like, ooh, it's not really a
it's
story.
Not good.
Yeah, that brings you happiness. So what's going on here?
It is not good. Yeah, unfortunately, a report from the Joint Intelligence Bureau, which was released, it was reported by The Drive and by ABC News, identified an incident that occurred earlier with a modified DJI Mavic 2. Some nefarious pilot modified their DJI Mavic 2 in order to attack an electricity substation. So this is, as far as we know, or as far as has been reported and documented by, the U.S. security forces, the first real attempt that we've seen by a drone on our electrical infrastructure, or power infrastructure, let's put it that way. So very unfortunate. It did not succeed. And I think that certainly all of the powers that be are supremely aware now that these kinds of attacks can occur. I think we are seeing many more protections go into place and more counter-drone solutions being put into place over our infrastructure. But again, this is a recurring theme. People need to think of security and defense now in 3 dimensions. It's not enough to have a fence. You've got to have something over the top to protect any kind of infrastructure. So the good news, it was not successful. The bad news is that, someone a little smarter might have been. So.
Well, I mean, most pilots try to avoid hitting power lines at all costs because we know the catastrophic consequences of doing so. Do we have any information on who was flying the drone or if they're able to track that person down?
I don't know the answer to that. No, they definitely found the drone and they were able to, pull it apart and see how it had been modified for this purpose. So this was, I guess the modification part was, is really just to say there's no doubt that this was a purposeful act. This was not an accident. It wasn't it wasn't clueless or careless. It was criminal. And so very unfortunate, but I think it's going to wake everybody up and help everybody to understand that certainly the professionals need to be very, very careful not to make mistakes where they can be misidentified as a problem. And, those secure areas do need to be secured in 3 dimensions. And I'll go back to something that I say about this kind of thing a lot, Paul, which is, people use cars for bad things. I'm in Boston, around the courthouse in Boston. You see these gigantic, hideous cement balls all around the courthouse, designed so that you cannot drive a van directly into the courthouse, to keep cars away because cars can cause damage. They can, you can put a bomb in a car, you can do whatever. So, we are accustomed to the fact that we need cars. There are going to be cars around. Cars are incredibly useful. Our society relies upon them, but we need to protect, sensitive infrastructure or whatever from a nefarious actor using a car to do damage. And, that's the way it is, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, I know you have been getting a lot of questions about this particular story. And in an effort of comedic relief, are you sure that this drone pilot wasn't trying to inductively charge his drone?
I did get asked that. I'm pretty sure. I don't know about you. Pretty sure they weren't just trying to charge their drone.
It would take a induction coil, a receiver coil, and then a regulator. It would take a lot of infrastructure.
Just buy a new battery. Pretty sure that's not what that was happening.
Oh wow! Well, man, there's a lot of things that are really going on in the industry on both ends. It seems like in the reminder of security, but also in how available drones are right now and how available that they will be in the future as a whole.
Yeah. I mean, think back, Paul, to I always found this sort of humorous. It provided many, many, many great stories for DroneLife, right? When drone registration came into being and it was pushed through before the holiday season and then, of course, subsequently struck down because it hadn't been open for the comment period and so forth. It wasn't put in place in the correct way. But the reasoning for sort of pushing through drone registration was because Christmas was coming and that was an emergency because you were going to have millions and millions of drones under the Christmas tree. And the idea that sort of, Christmas is an unforeseen emergency always struck me as pretty funny. But But I did get the point. It was a new and burgeoning hobby, and there were going to be a lot of these in the hands of maybe not skilled pilots very quickly.
Well, and look at history. It's shown of just how safe these millions of drones have truly been. So, which I think is a data point in itself for our friends that regulate aviation. Well, I know we've got these two stories regarding Mavics as a whole. Is there anything else that we are missing for this week, Miriam?
Here's another one that I thought was really interesting. And this is Auterion, who do the open source drone platform. Auterion is based in Europe, and they just hired a new president for their government solutions section. And, normally I don't really report on staffing and new people coming in, rarely. But this I actually thought was interesting because it shows that Auterion's really pushing forward with this idea of providing open source drones technology for government solutions. The idea being that what everybody knows is the safest possible solution. So they really believe that open source is the way to go, that open source provides ultimately the most secure and trusted solution for governments. And so that's really an interesting approach. I think that it's worth watching and worth seeing. And as more and more products are developed on the Auterion platform, we are seeing sort of more options out there and more things available. So I'm interested to see where that story goes.
Yeah, definitely interested to see too. If they're moving that whole unit stateside, what does that mean for their drones, Blue SUAS, and the like? Because it seems like there's a lot there for sure.
Interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, so I have one more thing that I have to tell you, which is that if anybody gets a chance to check out Xploration Station, that's Xploration Station, Life 2.0 is the name of the show. It's a STEM education show for kids, for everybody. And the latest episode is on drones, and I'm in it.
Oh, cool.
Very exciting. Very exciting. Check it out if you get a chance.
Awesome. We'll definitely have to check that out, Miriam. Thank you again for joining me and educating all of us on what's going on in the industry. We all, myself included, appreciate it.
Always fun to be here.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. If you leave us a comment, leave us a review, let us know what you thought of the show this week. Very curious too as to your response on the Mavic 3. Will you be buying one? Is it something that you're interested in? Does it help the domestic manufacturers? All these questions and more. But thank you again for joining us on another edition of Drone Life News.